Hey guys, so welcome to part 3 of this video series. I'm over at Tim's studio and just gonna have him go through some of the things he did to mix his track and some of the questions and some of the things I couldn't quite figure out how to best get done. So I guess to start off, Tim, like what do you do? What's the basic housekeeping stuff when you're a mixer and you get a delivery from a composer?
Okay, first of all, I got all the stems that you exported from your Logic session, which I'll kind of go from the bottom up, include all of the bones here, all of the trumpets, all of the saxophones, and horns, oboe, clarinet, flute. And then those are all grouped together. I grouped them all. I made groups for them. I actually bust them into separate aux groups as well. So they all kind of become one unit, if you will. And then you've got some ancillary tracks like the cowbell, the piano, vibraphone. I just left them individual. And then the bass, of course. Then you sent me the individual stems for percussion and drums, and I separated them out. So the drum kit is all going to one group, and all of the percussion goes to another group. So that's the first set of housekeeping. I guess the last little bit with that would be I put your demo that has no reverb up here, so I could constantly refer to that. Also, another good thing that you should do for a mix engineer is to give them a mix reference. So you want your song to sound like this, or parts of it to refer to a certain piece of music, and that's what I also have up here at the top that I can always turn on and refer to, and then come back to my mix.
Cool. In this case, the reference was the Austin Powers theme, the old Quincy Jones track Soul Bossa Nova.
Right.
And then, like, in that track, there were some unique signature things, I guess. There was like some kind of strange plate reverb, and there was also isolation on the left and the right. The left had the bones and the trumpets, the right had the saxes, and that's where I stole that from. Mm-hmm. And I know LCR recording is like still used by some of the rock mixers. You know, it doesn't cross over much into our world. Do you think that's a good technique to know for film composers?
I think mostly the LCR technique in this case is really beneficial in order to copy that sound that so many people did in the early 60s. They had no choice. And Quincy got creative with it because at that time there were only 4 tracks of multi-track recording. And so he had to think ahead and plan ahead really well how to use those tracks and grouping instruments and using reverb as well, using the stereo field.
So like when you do an LCR recording and you're getting mono, do you want to just take a mono track or a stereo track and pan it all the way to the left? Is that the same thing as hitting L, C, or R on like an old console? Or do you have to use like the S1 imager? How does it all come together? It's not there's no buttons for it anymore in our sequencers, I've noticed.
Right. So you have to think like they did. So he knew that he was going to have the trumpets and the trombones playing all at the same time. So however many microphones that is, that all gets funneled down to one mono track on the tape machine. And then he's got to decide what reverb he wants. So he's probably going to record that with reverb or maybe not, but chances are the reverb's going to go down the tape. So that ends up being one channel that has to be panned in one direction, left. I mean, it really doesn't get any more simple than that. In our world of Pro Tools and, so many mixing platforms, we've got such a command of the stereo field that they did not have. So it actually takes a lot of effort to get back to something that's so basic like that.
So with this track, there's like, I guess so mono reverb is kind of a thing. Can you show us in Pro Tools some of like how you got the reverb.
Yeah.
How do you take a bone dry track and give it a space, and then do you add reverb on that? Do you pan that hard to a direction? It's kind of a confusing way
Right.
to
Okay.
figure out.
All right. So let's do this. This is how I reference this. I'm gonna really look in detail at the reference track and listen really closely. All right. So let me do that first. I'm just going to move a little bit into the trumpets. So you can hear the trumpets and the bones in the beginning. They're all on the left. And it appears to me like their reverb is also on the left. And don't forget, back there in 1962, all you had for reverb is actually either a real room or plate. It's pretty much it. So that narrows it down for us. Now, how do I know where that reverb really is? So right now, I'm going to mute the right side and only listen to the left side. I hear a pre-delay before the reverb. I hear the initial bone hit and then a little space, then the reverb speaks. Now if I go over to...
Yeah, why is that? I've never quite figured out why that's a good or desirable thing.
Well, I'll tell you in a second. Let me listen to just the right side. So I don't hear as much of the pre-delay over there on the right side. I do hear some of the trombones ambiently, but mainly everything's happening on the left side. Now, so pre-delayed reverb, there's an advantage to that. Imagine you're in an acoustic space. You're in a big room with the trombone section. And let's say you're all the way at one end of the room and they're all the way up against the wall at another. You're not going to hear any pre-delay at all because you are now sitting at the opposite side of the room, which catches the initial reflection and then all of the ambient reflection from the room all at the same time. So if you both moved into the center of the room, the players and you as a listener, then you're going to get the initial dry signal much earlier, and then you're going to hear the reflected signal follow later, which of course perceptively increases this pre-delay. So that's the effect that he was trying to achieve at that point, which gets more definition to the instruments, but also gives it this space behind it.
So one of the things I struggle with, and I think somewhat of the holy grail of doing in sample world, we have a lot of, we'll take a track that has lots of samples on it and then add a solo element that you might record at your studio and be very close mic'd, like an overdub vocalist or an overdub cellist. And then you're going to bring it into a reverb plugin. How do you get it to sound good without being too washy or reverby? How does that all work?
Okay, it all depends on the setting. So that's a question that could take us out of this particular environment right now. It could be, a film score environment in which you want that instrument to be in the same acoustic space as the other instruments, but maybe a little bit more forward. So in that case, maybe I might give it the same exact hall that everything else has, but then a little pre-delay before that hall. So we're moving the instrumentalist closer to the listener.
So in like this example, did you take the saxophones and use the same reverb settings as you did with the trumpets?
Exactly, yes.
So
the
it's just
only
the same
difference
thing.
is I'm using two instances of this UAD EMT 140 plate, one on the left and one on the right. So that emulates that limitation that Quincy had back in the day of only 4 tracks and bouncing reverb in with the original recording.
So can you just click through show us the reverb settings?
Yeah.
With like maybe some of the saxes. Did you add reverb to the bass? Like what did you add reverb to?
Yeah, okay.
And is it like a send or an insert reverb?
Okay, great. So let's start with the trumpets and bones. because they're panned you panned them before you sent them to me, because that was your vision, so I maintain that vision, of course. And now I'm working with one instance. This right here is my first instance of the EMT plate. Somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds, leaning closer to 3. I have used quite a fair amount of pre-delay on this. This equates to about a 16th note at this tempo, and completely wet because my structure is as an aux send return situation, not as an insert. And I have actually applied a bit of a high pass filter to that as well, so that some of the lower frequencies don't cloud the mix. Now, heading down to the trumpets and the trombones.
Can you play some and bypass and show us?
Definitely.
You did.
Okay. So as I said, trumpets, they're all grouped together. Now I've got a little bit of some plugins on there, and then I'm also sending as well. But I'm going to mute all of that and just listen to the trumpets. By the way, I need to also explain that I'm using some inserts on the master bus, and I'm going to bypass them right now. You won't actually see this one bypass because that's a hardware compressor, and I'll explain that later. So, trumpets, dry. Okay, so staying with the topic of reverb, I have some of these trumpets going to send 1 and 2. Send 1 and 2 in this case happens to be a Bricasti M7. The setting is old plate. It's a little bit, and that emulates what I heard on the reference track when I heard a little bit of the ambience of the trombones on the right channel in addition to the left. And that is not 100% reflecting the practice in the 1960s, perhaps. But so that's my artistic license in that aspect. The other is, and that's a little bit more, is that left EMT plate 140. And if you look at the panning here, which I don't have the mix window up right now, but I'll show you this way, the panning is biased toward the left, as you can see.
So that's your reverb?
That's the reverb return. Yeah, it's the reverb return, and it's biased toward the left. Now, I'll just play this much. So you can hear that. I'll emphasize this plate, and then I'll bring it back. And I'll bring it back to where it was. I believe that was -5. Now, insert-wise, I've just increased a little bit of the brightness of that trumpet group as a whole, and I've also got a Pro MB, which is multi-band dynamic EQ. And sometimes the trumpets get a little heavy energy in the 3.5K range, and I'm also trying to increase a little bit of air in there while keeping that in check. So it's a very delicate treatment on the trumpet bus. Okay, and the same applies for the bones here.
So they're kind of partners, so they have the same treatment going on?
Exactly. The only difference with the bones is there was a little bit of low energy on the original recordings, and so I reduced that a little bit, and of course gave it some brightness as well. This too emulates the reference.
So how many decibels? That's 4 decibels you've added of brightness?
And brightness, it's about that, yeah.
Do you ever, I think one of the things we can all relate to is sometimes if you divide the spectrum of frequencies into low, medium, and high, there's lots of talk about videos about low buildup and how to handle low buildup. But I find sometimes especially when you use samples, you can get high-end buildup or medium high-end buildup. And did you have any buildup on this track when you start adding EQs?
No, it did with the trumpets a little bit themselves, and this is why I use that Pro MB in the 3.5K range. Other than that, collectively, no. Again, referring to that reference track, the brightest elements are the trumpets, bones, and then the saxes. And it doesn't matter that they both share brightness because they are separated by the center. The trumpets' bones live on the left and the saxes live on the right, so they can both be bright and coexist at the same time.
Okay.
So it's the information that's in the center now that becomes the key players in that point. So I don't want the instruments in the center to compete with those same frequencies. So that's a thought that I have for moving on.
What do you got going on in the center? And like, is there ever a point, I think some of the times when we're working, or when I'm not so experienced a mixer, when you have things panned on top of each other, say 0 degrees right in the middle, how does that change your gain structure? Do things hide behind? Like, what do you have going on the middle chain, the middle of the channel, and can you explain what's going on there?
So the latitude that I have now with things that are panned center and near about center, I have the option of depth, which means reverb. So I can either have something center and relatively dry, that means close to the listener, or I could have something center with more reverb, which means it's pushed back along the z-axis from the listener. And I've done that. Let's take, for example, the horns. So the horns are centered. You can see your bounce.
Can we hear some of those?
Is centered. So I'm going to mute all of my effect and reverb and play them. Okay, so I listened to that and I thought, as I was playing in the mix, I heard quite a bit of mid-range build-up. And I hear that would be competing with the other instruments, particularly the saxes, trumpets, trombones. So I applied this. And I did not want to use a standard static EQ because when the horns are not bearing down really hard, their frequencies are not bad, but then when they start blowing hard, it starts to build up in the middle. So I got this.
So a good time to reach for a multi-band compressor is when either from dynamics or range of the instrument changes kind of the EQ and you need to correct that, but most of the other time it's okay, that's when you go for an MB?
Exactly. It's when I hear that there is a frequency problem that is not consistent, that's when I reach for Pro MB. If it's consistent, no matter what dynamic or what range the instrumentalist is playing, then I go for a static EQ. Otherwise, I'm going for this Pro MB.
So the last part of that lick, it sounds like there's 4 French horns in unison, and sometimes you can get that organy effect. Did you notice any of that, or did you have to do any corrections when 2 instruments were in unison that were recorded both in the same, close mic, the same player stacking them?
Yeah, sometimes that does happen. In this case, I didn't correct for it, but sometimes I would if it really sounded egregious.
Okay, because I know I went through when I was doing the original one, I was muting some of the unisons, but I saw that wasn't muted.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it gets reverb as well. In this case, I've got bus 3-4, bus 5-6 dedicated to that EMT plate left and right, respectively. So since these guys are in the middle, I'm sending it on the middle reverb, or to left and right equally. Now again, this is not verbatim of what would have been done in the 60s, because in this case, it would have been sent to a reverb, and all of that reverb plus the horns put on one track in the center. So the reverb would have been mono as well. So in this case, it differs from that, and I'm taking that artistic license.
So when you're in mono, is mono center the same as stereo center? Or it's stereo center with like a, probably not the same as stereo center, but how does it work mono versus the spatial imager, with the Waves S1, or we have imagers in different, and can you get the same results using an imager as recording mono?
All right, so back to the basic principle. Center itself, the term center implies a discrete recording source, which means like one mono microphone, and a discrete playback, which is one speaker dedicated to the center channel. In this case, we don't. We're listening to a left-right speaker setup, which means there's a phantom center. And that means everything is panned equally to the left and the right speaker, which gives us the image that it is in the center. And furthermore, any additional sound must be literally equal on the left and right. In other words, there cannot be two different reverbs or two different EQs happening on one side and the other. Otherwise, it does not become true center anymore. So plugins, in terms of that, really just simplify, literally. Don't add any reverb, don't add any effect. You just pan the source center. Now, when you need to add effect, obviously you're going to use a mono EQ, mono whatever, compressor. And then effects, the return of those effects must be also panned center with no differing information on the left and right.
Okay. So speaking of other things that go in the center, could you tell us just a little bit what you did with drums? Did you compress them? Like, what compressor did you reach for? Why did you reach for it?
Okay. So
stuff like that.
Let's go up to so like I said,
maybe just play a little of the drums.
Yeah. I grouped the drum kit separately from the percussion. So let's just listen to the drum kit, and I'll take off everything that I had done. Okay, so listening to that, my choice was emulating what may have been done in the 60s. As you notice, we've got stereo tracks. All of these stems are stereo. And I've bussed them all to a mono bus. So this is mono. I'm already making it mono before it even gets out of the gate. Right down the center. So the only real major changes that I'm making inside the drum kit themselves are gain changes, volume changes inside here. You'll see a few volume changes. The hi-hats may have been a little bit bright, the cymbals and so forth. The only other changes are individual instruments. For example, the kick drum. Play just that. And in my judgment, that sounds a little close mic'd, like we're a little too close to it, and so perceptively I reduce a little bit of low mids. Same with the snare. So that increases our perception of being back from the drum kit a bit. Because in a band situation like that, I try to pretend like we actually got brass players, wind players, and sax players all in the same room with the drums and the bass. And where would they be? Drummer might be set back a bit. So I'm going to push the drummer back a bit, not only frequency-wise by lowering some of the low mids that you often find in a very present recording. I'm also going to give space by using the reverb, such as this.
So you put reverb
on the entire kit.
On all elements, including
Yeah.
the bass drum.
Exactly. Yes. 'Cause
Isn't it
that's-
like
That's exactly what would have been done, at that time. Miking a drum kit back then, you're lucky if you had a mic on the kick drum and then one overhead of the entire drum kit, and then you just that combination goes to a plate reverb.
Okay, so I was going to ask you about the low mid frequencies for moving things back. Like a lot when you're first learning mixing, they say 3K presence. How does the 3K differ from the low mids of what you're doing?
Okay, well, high frequencies, man, there's all sorts of ranges that you can talk about for presence. Every instrument has its own frequency range for presence. 3K, but if you think 3K across the board, then your mix is just going to be 3K heavy. Your trumpets are going to be too heavy in 3K, and then that's just going to be very fatiguing to the ear. So each instrument needs to have its own area in which it speaks. Maybe the horns are like 1.8K, the drum kit is around 5K and so forth. So you have to be really aware of that
So how do you learn all that? That seems like a lot of stuff to know. Is it just listening each mix to the materials you're given, or is it
exactly? And then just literally messing around with EQ and finding, raising stuff, lowering stuff, and finding out, am I taking away too much? Now it doesn't sound like the instrument. Oh, I'm boosting something that sounds like it's part of the instrument. Okay, great. And then trying to take whatever I take away from one instrument in that frequency range, I want to give to another and see if that works to support that instrument or not. You also have to learn just the natural frequencies of every instrument. Drums, cymbals, they speak kind of naturally around the 5K area. That's their area for presence. And so you want to be aware of that and not to overdo that frequency range in other instruments.
okay? So
Let me show you what else I did here with the drums. One thing I often found with these drums is cymbals tend to get in high frequency ranges. The high percussion instruments tend to overload a little bit, and it got fatiguing to me. And that's why I put a little bit of a Pro MB on the high end up here. So that evens out the high end so that there aren't spikes coming through from a cymbal crash or an open hi-hat or something like that.
could you show us a before and after of this?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to take away the reverb to highlight this a bit more. So here's a before. And after. Bypassed. I can even show you here this open hi-hat area. And after. It tends to even it out a little bit. I've done the same thing down here in the low mids as well, for the same reason I described before. Now, also, I've got a little bit of a tube compressor on the entire drum bus, as they would back in the day. It might be a Fairchild or something similar to that. So I'll put the reverb back on, show you before and after. Definitely emulates that early 60s sound for sure.
So when that emulates, does that have to do with the settings of the reverb of the compressor, or is that kind of the choice of the compressor, the tube tech specifically?
It is probably just a bit more the choice of and the nature of the tube emulated compressor. The settings are important too. Obviously, I don't want to have a completely fast attack because I want the impact of the drums to come through. and a fairly fast release, so the next impact can have an equal impact as the one prior to it. As for the bass, this is the original sound. So I'm going to show you what that sounds like in the mix. So that's a lot of bass. It's a lot of bass information. And considering 1962, that much bass would cause the lathe to run across the master disc when recording. So that's not going to work. That's one reason. And the second reason is playback systems back in the day, during the era of the LP, were naturally bass heavy. They accentuated the bass. I remember I had an old phonograph, Columbia phonograph, that was a 15-inch woofer with a tube amp. So LPs were, relative to today's standards, rather deficient in bass, and because the playback systems made up for it. If you played a modern recording on one of those LPs, phonographs, you'd probably blow the speakers. So we're going to calm it down, and I like the character of this Harrison EQ, so I used that, but that didn't get me 100%. Still got a lot of low frequency information. So I brought in the Pro Q, also helping out the mid-range a bit. And still, I noticed that some frequencies below 100 were poking through a bit. So that's why I used the Pro MB. And finally, to glue it all together, LA2A. And in the mix.
Okay, so I was wondering if you could show me. I noticed I've watched a lot of Dave Pensato videos and other mixing tutorials, and I noticed a lot of great mixers. Of course, they're great at plugins, and they're great at EQ and all of that. But they're also really good at doing automation and subtle automations. And I was wondering if you could show me automations like that you did in the mix, some that you did for your own taste, some things, maybe some where you had to correct something that I did. Can you show us what your automation window?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So clip gain is my friend in Pro Tools, and as I explained before, I've divided up some of these instrument groups and individual tracks and applied different clip gain.
What's your go-to when you're moving things up or down? Do you have a certain decibels you always go for?
Yeah, generally I like to have my tracks, in a small setting, and when I adjust volume automation, it does it in steps of 2 dB. I'll usually start with that, see how that works. So I tend to also limit. I don't want to overdo a lot of volume in automation on my tracks, and so I'll go for clip gain first where I can. And if it's a change in a group, for example, here on this percussion, I think when you came in to fine-tune the mix, we were working in automating the group of, say, clarinets or the saxes and so forth in different places. So I just automated the entire the bus for the clarinets, and that was much easier than going in and doing the clip gain for 4 or 5 different tracks at the same time.
So do clip gain, like, are you listening through for clip gain? I guess like Logic doesn't really have clip gain. So clip gain will be small changes on the region, and then for bigger changes or sectional changes you actually draw it in with the automation
No,
tool?
these could be big changes too in the clip gain. It's just that if it's inside of a group, I don't like to change the volume automation on individual tracks in the group.
So it's just a workflow thing. It's just
Yeah, it's a
clip gain,
workflow.
okay.
Exactly. Like, for example, here with the hi-hats. At the end of this section, if I kept the hi-hats at that gain, they would be much louder than this, as you can see the transition. That sounds like a natural transition right there. It wasn't when I kept it at -3. So all I needed to do was change the hi-hats right there. And I just preferred to do that, my personal preference, as clip gain rather than volume automation.
So is the idea of setting compressors and stuff do you do the automation first? What do you is having a good compressor setting limit your need for automation?
Oh no, definitely not. No, two different things. That compressor, especially the one I used for the drums, is really, it's a sonic thing. It's really about getting a tone of the drums. It's not controlling volume level or gain or anything like that, or reining it in. This is more of a tone, setting a tone that I know I'm looking for, especially that occurred in the reference track. So once I set that, then I can accurately set the volume automation of the individual instruments if I need to, especially as I listen to the entire mix. I'm hearing something stick out, and I'm making those fine-tuned changes like you and I did at the tail end of the mix, where certain sax lines needed to be brought out a little bit more and so forth.
So you set the compressor before you start doing automations?
Yeah, because it's a tone thing. I want to get that tone set first.
And then with like what you had on the master bus, how does that do you mix into that, or I've heard differentiating opinions on, you want to throw that on at the end or you want to mix into it. What did you do in this particular
Gotcha.
instance?
Well, in this case, the tools that I'm using on the master bus are first the tape emulation that you used.
The same
exact same setting.
It's a good preset.
Yeah, and it works well on the master bus. One thing that I noticed that it does in a really very elegant way is to rein in the irritating sibilance that's in the high frequencies around mid 6K range, and it also reins in some of that low mid range that can run away. Following by that with a hardware piece of hardware, we got the Zener. It's based off the EMI design, so it is a tube compressor, stereo master bus compressor.
Can you A/B some of what's going on in the master bus?
Yeah. And then what I do is the final thing is just a digital limiter that's essentially just putting a nice little delicate cap on everything. Now, to answer your question that you had before, is do I mix into that? No. I did my mix without any of that first, because I want to get as close as I possibly can to that sound that we're looking for. And then I kind of know in the back of my head that master bus tube compressor is also a part of that sound that I know I'll fine tune once I get to that point. Because once I've done the individual groups and gotten that tone, that means I'll probably need less of that master bus compressor in the end. So let me show you the mix as it is right now without the master plugins. And I'm going to bring up the tape machine. I'll play without it, and then I'll kick it on halfway through that opening piece. Okay, and next I'm going to actually engage the Zener tube limiter. compressor, actually. Bypassed. In. And finally with that limiter on top. And that's essentially bringing us into the 21st century with digital limiting for our outlets these days of iTunes and so forth.
Okay, so when you have the limiter on, just for conclusion, since we're not hiring a mastering engineer to do this, like where's a good point to have, like you said, if you want to go to iTunes or Facebook or whatever, where's a good point to have your needles moving?
Well, there's all sorts of very specific guidelines for iTunes and so forth. But what I will do is look for a few of the key loudest places in the mix. I'll say here in the beginning, here in the middle, and I'm trying to achieve a very delicate amount of gain reduction on these loudest points. I do not want, waveforms squared off. I'm just looking for a little delicate gain reduction on the loudest points, such as this. As you can see, it just barely tweaked the attenuation by about maybe 2 dB, and that's all I'm looking for. It's almost a protective kind of a limiter.
So is the idea with the limiter in iTunes release that you want to have it be close to unity, have it close to be 0 decibels, or is that a school of thought thing? How does that work?
Well, so, just in a practical sense, a lot of people are listening to music on iPads, iPhones, laptop computers, and of course they have limitations of their own in terms of gain, so it has to be a certain loudness, or else people just are going to struggle to hear it. So that's one part of it. And then another part of it, when you bear down on the limiter, it starts to sound like crap because you're squaring off these waveforms. So I'm riding that line between the two.
Okay. So if you were delivering to a mastering engineer, you would simply turn off, because I know they like to have some room to add gain.
Yeah.
You would just turn off everything on your master channel, or would you make any other changes?
I would turn off everything on my master channel for sure. This compressor, that limiter. However, this tape machine, that would be a discussion I'd have with the mastering engineer. I might say, hey, do you have a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch mastering tape machine that we could use? And if he or she said yes, then I would take it off. If not, I'd leave it on.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that's a pretty thorough look at what we were doing here on this track, and I know this video was a little talkative, but I hope you guys enjoyed it and got some tips, and we'll see you around for the next video. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, you're welcome.